Okay, let's jump in. I want you to start with this idea, which sounds like something out of a historical drama, really. The idea that two people can be legally married, maybe for years, decades even. They have kids, a house, and then the law, or the church, can turn around and declare that the marriage never actually existed.
It just erases it.
It completely rewrites history. It's a really shocking concept.
It fundamentally does. And that is the crucial difference between what most people know as divorce and what we're going deep on today. Annulment. Or I should say, a declaration of nullity.
Right.
A divorce says a valid contract ended today. An annulment is a finding that the contract was invalid from the very beginning, ab initio, as the lawyers would say.
So it's retroactive. It's like, legally speaking, you didn't just stop being married. You were never married at all.
Precisely. You're proving that some fundamental flaw was there from the moment the vows were exchanged. And our mission for this deep dive is to explore how these different systems, civil law, Christian canon law, Islamic law, even modern psychology, how they all try to define what makes that original contract valid.
And it all seems to circle back to two core pillars, right? Consent and consummation.
Consent and consummation, that's where it all begins.
Okay, so let's start with the civil law basics, because this distinction between a void marriage and avoidable marriage, I mean, that's where the whole legal architecture starts.
It is, and it matters so much because of who has the power to end the union. Is it the state or is it the individuals?
Okay, unpack that for us.
So a void marriage is invalid from the very beginning, ab initio, because it violates a really fundamental public policy law. So you're thinking of things like bigamy.
Marrying two people at once.
Exactly. Or marriage between close relatives, or in some places, forced child marriage. The marriage is just, it's such a violation that the state treats it as if it never happened.
So you don't even really need a court to say it's over, because it never was.
Technically, no court action is required, though of course people seek an annulment for the paperwork, for documentation.
Right. But avoidable marriage is different. It's not, illegal from the get-go. It's just flawed.
That's a perfect way to put it. Avoidable marriage is considered completely valid until one of the parties successfully goes to court to contest it. So it can only be canceled at the option of one of the spouses.
And what are the grounds for that usually?
The common civil grounds are things like fraud. A spouse lied about something really vital, like their ability to have children, maybe a previous marriage, or duress, coercion, mental incapacity at the time of the wedding.
And I think this is a key point. If one of the spouses dies, the option to annul that voidable marriage, it dies with them.
It does. Which isn't true for a void marriage, because a voidable marriage was only challengeable by the living parties. This makes things like property division, the status of children. It all gets so much more complicated under civil law when a marriage is voidable versus void.
What happens to the kids if the marriage is declared void?
Well, that's where it gets tricky. In some systems, the state might classify the couple as having had a quitative marriage, which can protect the financial or status rights of children born during that union, even if the marriage itself was legally non-existent.
Okay, so the stakes are high. But let's go back to that idea of the state stepping in. You mentioned this is where it gets into some serious human rights issues, especially with forced marriage.
This is absolutely crucial in modern human rights law. If a jurisdiction classifies a forced marriage as void, meaning illegal from day one, the state can actively intervene to cancel it.
Even if the spouses don't want to, or are maybe afraid to.
Exactly. Even if they're pressured by family not to file, it's a safeguard. But if the law only calls a forced marriage voidable, then only the spouse who is coerced can petition the court to end it.
That's a massive loophole.
It is. It essentially leaves victims of coercion without a safety net, forcing them to start this terrifying legal process all on their own.
So it seems like calling a coerced marriage voidable is, it's a failure of public policy. It puts the entire burden on the victim.
Many legal scholars would agree, and that's why we're seeing countries adapt. The sources you found point to Australia, for instance. They got rid of the whole concept of voidable marriage way back in 1975.
Just to simplify things.
To simplify and to strengthen their family law. But then you have other systems, like in England and Wales, that still have voidable marriages. And that's where we get our first look at that other pillar, consummation.
Right. Non-consummation is still grounds for an annulment there.
For opposite-sex unions, yes. But that ground was specifically excluded for same-sex marriages in 2013, which shows you how these definitions are constantly evolving.
And this all just shows how intricate these civil systems are. I mean, look at the Philippines. They don't have divorce at all.
So they've had to build this entire highly complex legal architecture just around these two ideas. Was the contract flawed from the start, or did it just become flawed later? It's all they have.
Okay, so now let's move to the system that really, really focuses on the theological meaning of all this. Catholic canon law. This is where it gets so interesting, because a declaration of nullity isn't about ending a marriage. It's about confirming it never even formed.
That's exactly it. For Catholics, marriage is a sacrament, so it's presumed to be valid unless you can prove otherwise. And the exchange of consent-free, informed, intentional consent, that is the single indispensable element that makes the marriage.
So if you can prove that consent was flawed,
There is no marriage, and the Church grants that declaration of nullity.
but then we get into this really powerful, almost mystical Latin term you pointed out, radam sed non consummatum. Ratified but not consummated.
Yes.
Explain how this one single physical act can change the entire nature of the religious bond.
This is the theological deep end. The moment valid consent is exchanged, that's radam. The couple is truly sacramentally married, however. A marriage that is radam et consummatum, ratified and consummated, is considered absolutely indissoluble.
Indissoluble.
No human power, not even the Pope, can dissolve it. Only death.
So that one act creates a bond that is just impervious to any human authority. But if it stays, radam sed non consummatum.
It is not indissoluble. That marriage bond, while it's real, it can actually be dissolved by the Pope for a just reason.
Wait, I have to stop you there. Because to a layperson, that sounds exactly like a divorce. If the Pope can dissolve it, doesn't that mean the marriage was real? How is that different?
That's an excellent question, and it's a critical distinction. The Church holds that the marriage bond does exist through consent. They are truly married. But the Pope's power, sometimes called the patrine privilege, it intervenes for the good of their souls because the sacramental covenant hasn't been fully sealed by that physical act.
So it's a dissolution of a real but sort of incomplete sacramental bond.
Exactly. It's not a declaration that the bond never existed in the first place, which is what the annulment is. It's a different mechanism entirely.
Okay, that clarifies it. And it all hinges on a very, very specific definition of what consummation actually means in canon law.
It is intensely specific. Canon 1061.1 defines it as the spouses performing, quote, in a human manner, a conjugal act suitable in itself for the procreation of offspring.
And that phrase, in a human manner, that's key, isn't it? It goes right back to consent.
Absolutely. The act has to be voluntary.
Yeah.
Cognizant. If the act involves force, if a husband rapes his wife, or if one spouse is, say, unconscious or extremely intoxicated, that act does not constitute canonical consummation. The free will has to be there.
And this definition has had just immense historical weight. I mean, we all know the story of Henry VIII using non-consummation to annul his marriage to Anne of Cleves.
A very famous, very pragmatic use of canon law for political ends, yes. But the sources you found had a stunning modern example from the former Soviet bloc.
Right, with the housing shortages after World War II.
Yes. So many young couples would have their wedding, they'd exchange vows, making the marriage radam, but then they'd go back to living separately with their parents for years, waiting for housing.
So they were married, but never lived together, never consummated.
Exactly. They remained radam sed non consummatum, and if, years later, they realized it wasn't working, they could actually petition the Pope, who could dissolve the marriage because that bond had never been fully sealed. An ancient rule solving a 20th century problem.
That is just genuinely fascinating. And we should also mention, the ability to consummate is a condition of validity itself.
That's right. The Code of Canon Law states that an, quote, antecedent and perpetual impotence to have intercourse nullifies marriage by its very nature. A permanent inability to perform the act means the contract is invalid from the start.
So let's move from that, from centuries of canonical law to the challenges of modern partnerships. What happens when intimacy fails? Not because of inability, but because of, well, fundamentally incompatible desires.
And this is where the emotional and psychological sources really take over. We're in the messy reality of expectations versus reality now. The sources you found discuss mixed orientation relationships a lot, specifically with asexual or ace partners.
Which affects about 1.7% of the population.
Yeah, it does. And yet these individuals often end up in relationships with allossexual or non-ace partners.
And why is that?
Well, often because they didn't realize asexuality was a valid orientation to begin with, or they fell in love before the differences became a real issue. The key insight here is what's called the split attraction model. An ace partner can be intensely romantically attracted. They might be biromantic, panromantic, but still have absolutely no desire for sexual activity.
Which has to create immense strain, especially when society basically screams that sexual intimacy is the core of a marriage.
It requires just continuous, honest renegotiation. The fundamental insight is that the ace partner should never be treated as if they're broken or need to be cured. The whole relationship has to be redefined around other forms of intimacy.
And even between two allosexual partners, you see this profound pain of just mismatched libidos. Those Reddit threads we looked at were just heartbreaking.
They were defining a sexless marriage as, what, no activity for a year or more.
Compared to the US average of 58 times a year.
The emotional weight there is tremendous. The partner with the higher libido often feels loved but not wanted. And it's that feeling of rejection that's what creates the crisis.
There was that quote that it was brutal. Whoever has the lower libido has the power and say of your sex life.
That captures the reality perfectly, doesn't it? The maximum frequency the higher libido partner can ever expect is dictated by the other person. It forces a couple to confront whether this is something they can compromise on.
This issue of sexual expectation brings us back to cultural contexts, especially arranged marriages. And we have to be really clear here about the divide between consensual arranged marriage and forced marriage.
Absolutely. One is a valid contract where both people could say no. The other is a crime, a human rights violation. Simple as that. In consensual arranged marriages, there's often no premarital sex, but there is an extremely strong cultural expectation of consummation and procreation after the wedding.
And in some systems, like Islamic law, this is even codified as a right.
That's right. In Islamic law, the wife has a right to sexual fulfillment, the haqqul una. The husband is religiously obligated to meet these needs. It's so central that historically, Caliph Umar ruled that a husband shouldn't be away for more than about 6 months.
To balance the needs of the state with the wife's right to companionship.
Exactly.
So we've gone on this huge journey from that ancient idea of a one-off act sealing a bond forever, all the way to modern systems grappling with ongoing desire. What's the final overarching legal takeaway today?
The unwavering principle is that consent within the marriage has to be absolute, and it has to be ongoing. Modern legal systems have abolished the old notion of a conjugal right to sex on demand. Marital rape is a crime. The law has moved decisively away from the idea that wedding vows grant perpetual consent.
Consent has to be freely given every single time.
Every single time. That is the core of a valid relationship today.
We've really covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? I mean, from the complex civil law labels of void and voidable to the powerful theological weight of a single act of consummation, and then all the way to the modern, often painful, need to navigate things like libido and orientation.
And through all of it, through all these diverse systems, whether it's a religious tribunal or a civil court, the search for validity always comes back to the state of consent between the two people.
It all hinges on freedom of choice.
Was the intent free? Was the contract entered into willingly? That's always the core question.
And that brings us back to what I think is the most critical shift. In so many of these historical traditions, the marriage bond was sealed by that one single act of consummation, once. But today, we recognize that a healthy marriage requires ongoing, freely given consent. So what if? What if the most robust definition of a valid, functioning marriage today isn't one single historical act, but the consistent, honest dialogue about intimacy itself, renegotiated day by day? That shift from a single moment to a continuous conversation, that's something to mull over until our next deep dive.